Will you hear this word from the book of Genesis? I'm in chapter 21. I'm reading verses 10 through 17. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your ancestor, and the God of Isaac, your father. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and all the families of earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. Then Jacob woke up from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. May God add God's blessing to the hearing of this word. The last few Sundays of June, you have been watching online a video that Rusty and I have recorded for you before the rest of us have gathered out in the parking lot for our regular worship service. We've been doing drive-in church this month, and I've got to tell you that drive-in church is not as easy as I thought it was going to be. There is this whole business of trying to transmit our voices into the vehicles of those people who are in attendance, and it's been really frustrating. A lot of background noise and a lot of static, so that one week the people in their vehicles can hear the worship leader and not me. The next week they can hear me and not the worship leader. And we haven't been able to figure out the rhyme or reason to our problem with that. So suffice it to say, I've been a little preoccupied with transmitting lately. And because I have been, something I read this week grabbed my attention. I hope that it will speak to you as well. It's from a book entitled How to Make It Through the Day. It's written by John Carmody. Carmody writes this: God can only transmit effectively if we are good receivers. How about that? God can only transmit effectively if we are good receivers. This passage that I just read to you about Jacob, I think we could say that he was able to effectively receive what God was transmitting to him. You may remember that Jacob had a twin brother named Esau, and Esau was just a few minutes older than Jacob, but since he was the first twin to emerge from their mother's womb, he earned the birthright as the firstborn child. That birthright made him the future head of his family, and it would also give him judicial authority as the patriarch. In addition, it granted him a double portion of his father's wealth and also his father's blessing. It was just a whole lot for Esau to gain and for Jacob to lose over a matter of seconds in their birth. And as you read the story, you kind of get the impression that this becomes a point of contention for Jacob. And we can assume that pretty easily because when the twins get older, Jacob steals Esau's birthright. And because he does, Esau vows to kill him. So Jacob is where he is in the story that I just read for you because he is on the run. He's trying to put as much distance as he can between himself and his brother's plan for revenge. And one night, as he's making this escape, Jacob stretches out on the ground with the rock for his pillow, and he goes to sleep. And as he's sleeping, he has a dream. He dreamt of a ladder that reached from earth all the way up into heaven. He saw angels traveling up and down that ladder. And even more importantly, Jacob felt the presence of God with him. In this vision, this dream, God even relayed a promise to Jacob. It was the same promise that God had made Jacob's grandfather Abraham. That promise was that one day their descendants would claim the very spot where Jacob was sleeping. And there would be so many of that descendants, they would spread out in every direction on the land that God intended to give them. Well, when Jacob woke up from this dream, he was aware of God in a way that he had never been aware of God before. Because you see, he was receiving, right, what God was transmitting to him. And you know why I think Jacob was such a good receiver at that particular point in his life? I think it was because he was in such a vulnerable position. He was running for his life. He was needful and he was desperate. And it made him more receptive to the vision and the presence and the promise of God. And that is often the case with us. We're more receptive to God's presence when we're more in need. In truth, we have to be in an attitude of surrender. We have to be open to our own vulnerability if we want to develop a deeper and a more authentic relationship with God. It's just like we heard John Carmody say, God can only transmit effectively if we are good receivers. And when we recognize our need for God, we are, of course, much more receptive to God. In the tales about Jacob, he always appears to be this self-made man who gets what he wants from his own striving and even his own conniving. But in the backstory that runs through Jacob's life, it's actually God's presence that sustains him, not in spite of his lack of character, but right in the midst of it. And each time Jacob recognizes his need for something or for someone greater than himself, he's suddenly more receptive to all that God has been transmitting to him and for him. And that's why when he wakes up from this dream, he's able to proclaim, surely the Lord is in this place. The people and the resources that have been the most helpful to me in understanding my relationship with God are those individuals and those resources that have taught me the importance of my own vulnerability. When we admit our need for a source that's greater than we are, when we're willing to surrender to the holy presence, we come to a much better understanding of the divine-human relationship and the union that our soul is craving. So one way that we understand Jacob's ladder to heaven is to recognize that our need for God opens up our access to knowing God's presence. We're taught in the Christian community that we don't have to be perfect before we seek the divine-human relationship. And I would say it's actually our imperfection and the need that it creates within us that carries us to the throne of heaven. Remember, the Apostle Paul writes in his letter to the Romans chapter 5, verse 8, that while we were yet sinners, God showed God's love to us in Jesus Christ. So there's no amount of striving on our part, there's no amount of conniving on our part that's going to win God's loving presence. But our vulnerability gives us entrance into the holy dominion of our Lord. Actually, here Jesus referred to Jacob's ladder in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 51. In that particular text, Jesus is talking to a disciple named Nathanael, and he says to him, you're going to see heaven open up and the angels of God ascending and descending on me, the Son of Man. So when he says this, Jesus is talking about his crucifixion. He was saying to Nathanael that in his own death, even in the cross itself, Jesus would be able to proclaim, just like Jacob, the Lord is in this place. The most vulnerable experience of his life was a time when the vision and the presence and the promise of God were revealed in and to and through Jesus. I think that the longer we've been proclaiming our Christian faith, the more likely we are to get puffed up in it, to believe that we've matured, to believe that just like Jacob, we are entitled to our birthright as God's children. We might assume that our knowledge of Scripture, our worship attendance, our 10% tithe, our good deeds, our spiritual gifts, all of these grant us easy access to the God of all grace. But this God of grace is actually most accessible when we drop all the pretense and admit that we are nothing and we have nothing and we can offer nothing apart from our own desperate desire to know God more fully, even as we are fully known. Jacob's ladder is symbolic then for that space in each human heart where we crave a relationship with something greater than ourselves, the source of all being. As we humbly admit our longing and our need for holy God, we mirror the image of Christ, who gives body and blood for this divine human relationship. And then when we are mirroring the vulnerability of Jesus, that door of heaven swings open for us. And I don't mean to imply that it swings open for us after we die. I mean that the doors of heaven open for us now in our vulnerability with an invitation to abundant life. So as we gather in worship, I want to ask you where you find yourself. Are you on the run trying to protect your image? Are you striving and conniving to win the favor of other people? Maybe you are sleeping with your head on that hard rock of pride and self-assertion. Or do you know that there is no one to save you and no one to favor you and no one to offer you the rest that you truly need except for the Lord of grace? Are you holding on to your spiritual accomplishments? Or are your sights trained on the vision and the presence and the promise of God? I'll be the first to admit that admitting our weakness is a difficult thing for us to do. But God finds us in our needfulness and in our own vulnerability. The ladder to heaven is lowered down in the crucified Christ. So may you come to terms then. May we all come to terms with our need for surrender. Remember, God can only transmit effectively when we are good receivers. Help us, Holy God, in our great need to receive all that you so long to transmit. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, we are so thankful that you are always reaching out towards us, always transmitting to us. Help us to be good receivers. Help us to admit our need for you. Help us to come to terms with our own vulnerability in your presence, and allow us to rise up on the wings of love by this ladder to heaven, your grace through Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen. May you go in grace and in peace.